War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 33, Sun Tzu. Sun Tzu is the most influential writer on warfare in history, uniquely read and quoted by both Eastern and Western leaders, transcending mere military theorists and practitioners. For ubiquitous theories of conflict, economic, political, and to the point of this podcast, military, he is unmatched in brevity, wit, and insight. Indeed, so much of what he says seems almost intuitive until you realize it's not intuition, rather infusion of thought going on over 2,000 years. So, who was this giant of combative philosophy? As noted earlier, I don't think he's real, though there's ample evidence either way. He lived within the latter half of the 500-year Eastern Zhao period, known, fittingly, as the Warring States period, from 771 to 250 BC. His real name was reportedly Sun Wu, Wu being the region and Sun being the name. Sun Tzu is an honorific, meaning master Sun. His descendant, Sun Bin, also wrote An Art of War, and the two combined were often considered Sun Tzu. The Warring States period was one of constant war between 7 main entities, several smaller ones, and ultimately ending with the consolidation of China into the first imperial dynastic state, the Qin dynasty. Much like the Peloponnesian War, there were constant alliances as power waxed and waned, with weaker uniting to counter stronger, stronger bullying and forcing alliances or granting protection for assistance. Unlike Greece, there was no pretense of government other than strong men, far more feudalistic than democratic or even monarchical, though the title of king was thrown about regularly. Perhaps the biggest difference, and one that seems fantastical to Western ears, was the size of the armies contesting control of China. Armies of 200,000, 500,000, 600,000, even up to 1 million are reported. Commensurate are casualties, where the Battle of Yike reports 240,000 killed. Like Sun Tzu himself, I think these numbers are as much fantasy as truth. That myth and memory melded to create tales that told and embellished the infant history of a united China. Far more Homer than Thucydides or even Herodotus. Infantry, cavalry, and chariots comprised the early combat arms, the crossbow and pike being the primary weapons, which quickly eroded the earlier chariot-based dominance. Not unlike the 100-Year War, as the bowmen replaced French knights as the combat arm of decision. A giant country with giant armies, waging total war on civilian populations, countryside, and the armies themselves. There were no norms of combat, no treaties, nor even a shared religion which would curb the cruelty of early Eastern conflict. It is within that context that Sun Tzu must be read to be understood. It must also be highlighted that Sun Tzu is not the only author of that period. The Book of Keys, 36 Stratagems, is an absolutely brilliant collection of maxims, very similar in spirit to Sun Tzu's Art of War and far shorter. Its most famous saying is, if all else fails, retreat, and is summarized in a Chinese idiom, of the 36 stratagems, fleeing is best. This goes against much of the Western vein of warfare. This avoidance of warfare is infused throughout Sun Tzu, and is the key difference between East and West when it comes to war. Retreat is not seen as inherently cowardly. Rather, continuing to fight even when you can't win is not romantic, it's foolish. The beauty of the Eastern philosophy of war is often found in the euphemism and idioms that permeate. In the 36 stratagems, the tactics have names such as lure the tiger down the mountain, or watch the fires burning across the river, take the opportunity to pilfer a goat, and hide a knife behind a smile. And probably my favorite, and frankly much of the reason for this podcast, borrow a corpse to resurrect the soul, which means to find an ancient and discarded tactic, weapon, or even philosophy, and use it for modern purposes. So for general purposes, simply reading Sun Tzu would be fine, and give you the idea of the Eastern philosophy. However, if you really want to understand China, read everything you can, because Chinese military doctrine and thought is a Fascinating blend of Clausewitz, Lenin, and the Asian ancients. So with that, on to Sun Tzu, and more to the point, his Art of War. The book has 13 chapters. It's self-notable, as 13 by itself is considered lucky, but adds to 4, which translates to death. There's one thing to take away in studying Sun Tzu, is everything has a secondary meaning. I have referred to Sun Tzu as sneaky in an earlier podcast. Security and surprise are always the competing priorities. Always surprise your enemy. Never be surprised yourself. The first chapter on planning builds upon Taoist philosophy and lays out the 5 key factors: climate, ground, mission, command, and methods. It corresponds very roughly to the 5 classical elements as taught: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. This is how educated Chinese of his era, and the current era to a certain degree, were taught to think. And so his Art of War was shaped deliberately, and probably unavoidably, in the same direction. But going back to the 5 key factors, they correspond quite nicely to the 5-paragraph operation order, sometimes called the op-ord: situation, mission, execution, logistics, and command. While obviously paragraph 4, logistics, called service and supply in U.S. Army speak, is missing directly, Sun Tzu does not neglect logistics in his writing. One of the problems and paradoxical advantages of reading Sun Tzu in English is that the original text is written in an almost mathematical way. The use of numbers, from the number of chapters to the 5 key factors in the earlier 36 stratagems, is these use of numbers took Taoist philosophy and teaching methods and doctrine and nested them. As people far more educated in these things than I am have explained, it's impossible to accurately translate Sun Tzu in all his brilliance into English. There was vast nuance in his use of Chinese symbols that carried great meaning, but only to those trained in understanding their subtlety and double or even triple meanings. You need 3 different definitions of the same word in order to possibly understand his true meaning. But this would also render the book 10,000 pages long to translate it properly. Each sentence in the original would require a full page or more to explain it, and even that wouldn't be enough. To truly understand Sun Tzu, you must first be a classically trained Chinese scholar, fluent in ancient Chinese, and having studied the various philosophical texts which defined it. So why is this also an advantage? Well, to the layperson, what you are left with are hundreds of pithy bon mots standing alone, fortune cookie deep, which render them, to the military professional, almost superficial and obvious. Often these quotes have been shaped by the translator to make them more attractive to the Western eye, but removing the true intent and meaning as understood in the context. In making the translation, the translator is imparting the wisdom more than Sun Tzu. What magnifies this paradox is that while Sun Tzu's work is translated as the Art of War, he really was attempting to make a science of strategy and incorporating the various factors of enemy and friendly into a calculation which would tell the general when to attack and when to defend. But the science behind his Art of War is, literally, lost in translation. So what is left is a far more artful and whimsical depiction than what was originally intended, and, ironically, leaves the horrifically inaccurate translation probably more useful, as time has rendered much of the attempted science of the original out of date. Here again I return to Clausewitz and his fascinating trinity of fiery passion and random chance and cold calculation. Sun Tzu, in attempting the latter, has brought to a non-Chinese audience a buffet of quotes that reinforce the 2 former. So let's take one very famous example of Sun Tzu. If you know yourself, know your enemy, and know the terrain, in 1,000 battles you will never be at risk. Somewhat obvious, and to the Western ear doesn't necessarily imply an absolute knowledge. Rather, the more you know of these 3 factors, the more successful you will be. And accepting that chance and passion renders complete understanding impossible, your plans could always be at risk of some failure. But in the original, it implied a literal and complete understanding of these factors. Sun Tzu believed these to be attainable, and thus, the strategist so trained in his methods, undefeatable. You will note I said undefeatable, not invincible or victorious. Rather, these calculations will tell you less how to win a war and more of when to avoid one. Again, this goes against the offensive über alles attitude of Western warfare. But avoiding a war you will lose is, to me, more important than knowing how to win wars. So back to the 13 chapters. I will defer to the recent Chinese-based translation by Chao Haohui for the names of the chapters. My ridiculously simplistic overviews are inherently going to be wrong. If you really want to know Sun Tzu, read him. Chapter 1 is the detail assessment and planning. One might call this the war plans, discussing the 5 fundamental factors. That countries must never go to war without a great deal of planning beforehand. Advice I cannot recommend enough. That all warfare is based in deception. Subtlety and subterfuge should permeate all your planning. Chapter 2 is on waging war. Here logistics permeates as the cost of war, especially considering the reported size of the armies, constantly overhangs the general. Limiting the cost to the nation must always be a consideration. The squeeze must never exceed the juice, even if it means abandoning your initial objectives and buying peace even at the cost of victory. His famous statement that no state has ever benefited from a drawn-out conflict comes from Chapter 2, as well as the Napoleon-approved operational concept of drawing all supplies from the enemy's territory and not your own. Chapter 3 is the strategic attack. Here he lists the 5 factors of success: attack, strategy, alliance, army, and cities, how each must be considered and integrated into victory. The 5 essentials for victory are listed: knowing when to fight and when to not, knowing how to deploy an army, having a united army, being prepared for surprises, and ensuring the ruler doesn't interfere with the general. Chapter 4 is the disposition of the army. Here, maintaining the safety of the army through defenses and security, how to spot and exploit opportunities, how to ensure you aren't surprised by the enemy. The 5 steps of war are defined in turn: measuring, estimating, calculating, comparing, and then, finally, victory. If done properly, victory is preordained by the preceding 4 steps. Chapter 5 is simply titled Forces. Here, momentum of the attack is highlighted, and how to use this to destroy the enemy, pursuit and attack, building upon success, seizing the tactical opportunities that the chaos of battle affords, that an army should be like a taut bowstring, and the general must release that energy at the precise moment of victory. Chapter 6 is Weaknesses and Strengths. Many of Sun Tzu's most famous quotes stem from this concept. When weak, appear strong. When strong, appear weak. Attack the enemy at his weakest point, never his strongest. Returning to B.H. Liddell Hart and his indirect approach. Here he opines that each victory is unrepeatable. The circumstances of battle will always be different, as well as the famous demand that armies be like water. Follow the lay of the land. War and water have no constant form. Chapter 7 is Military Maneuvers. And perhaps the greatest contrast to Western thought, the decisive battle is never to be sought unless complete victory is ensured. If the superior general forces you to engage, how to disengage and save your army. That the shaping of the enemy, the battlefield, and your forces should be ongoing until your superiority is unquestioned. One of his famous sayings here is, "Leave a path for a besieged army, and do not obstruct a retreating army." I must disagree with the master here. Chapter 8 is Variations and Adaptability. Here is discussed how a general must always be aware of changing circumstances and advance or retreat as these variations help or hinder his plans. Flexibility is the key to victory, and here he lists the 5 failures of a general: recklessness, cowardice, anger, misplaced compassion to his men, and an overdeveloped sense of honor. Chapter 9 is Movement and Development of Troops. More time is spent focusing on the enemy and determining his intent, and thus maneuvering your forces to counter his plans. Here he lays down one of the basic premises of always seize the high ground and keep your enemy in front of you. Chapter 10 is simply terrain. Back to know yourself, know your enemy, and know the terrain. Here he lists the 3 general factors of terrain, of distance, dangers, and barriers, and how to analyze them. Then he goes into the 6 types of grounds and the various advantages and disadvantages each provides. He also states openly the general alone is responsible for success or failure. If the king says to attack, but the attack will fail, the general must retreat. Likewise, if the king says defend, and should the opportunity arise to destroy the enemy, the general must attack. The best general is one who makes decisions without seeking fame or fearing blame. Chapter 11 is the 9 battlefields. Here he lists the different circumstances an army at war may encounter and what the commander must do to succeed in all of them, or, at least, avoid failure. He also keys on using terrain to divide the enemy forces, denying them mass. The importance of speed and, again, taking an indirect approach is highlighted. Well-defended enemies should be countered by attacking something the general cherishes, hostages if need be. Chapter 12 is attacking by fire. Weapons of the era are discussed as well as how to use the environment as a weapon. He discusses the 5 targets for attack. Attack the weakest troops, destroy the logistics base of the enemy, use mobility on land and sea, launch a preemptive strike, launch psychological attacks. He literally discusses the best ways to use fire, the seasons, the winds, all of this. And chapter 13 is intelligence and espionage. Sun Tzu is a big fan of spying, seeing it as the basis of all good warfare. As you must know your enemy, as well as you know yourself, spies are the essential aspect of planning. Yet again, 5 types are discussed. Local, who are citizens of the enemy state. Inward, who are double agents, converted. Former spies now working for you. Doomed, expendable spies who relay false information. And finally, surviving, traditional spies who gather information. Sun Tzu states, reasonably, that no amount spent on spies is too much when compared to the cost of waging war. As Sun Tzu is the basis of strong against weak, it seems only right to use this baseline to what has been termed asymmetric warfare, guerrilla warfare, irregular warfare, or, if one is wise, simply war, which we will go over next week. Thanks for joining us today. If you liked what you heard, please like, subscribe, rate, and comment. Most importantly, share with your friends. Join the conversation at the War 102 subreddit. And check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for links to more information and supporting videos. Send me an email at war102podcast@gmail.com. I look forward to your comments and hope you join us again next week. See you then.